Hi, it's Jen again. Thought I would go ahead and make a video responding to a comment that I got, or request I should say, in my YouTube channel comments to make a video on stat balancing. I don't really have a very methodical approach to creating my stats and abilities, so I don't know how helpful this will be, but I thought I would just go ahead and throw it out there for anybody who's interested. So I have a long history of playing games, from card games to board games to dice games to tabletop games to video games of all kind of different stripes, and I've always been interested in like what makes these games work, what the win conditions are, what the types of odds that I'm going against, and how to maximize my effectiveness in these games. And not to say that I'm good at any of these games. Sometimes my theory is way better than my execution. I will take like fighting games for instance, because I am just enamored with the animation and storytelling and mechanics of fighting games, even though I am not a competitive person and I don't have the chops to sit there in the practice modes and like really get my inputs consistent and to be able to execute some of the more technical type combos and things. But I really find the mechanics and kind of like from both like the programming standpoint, from like the character animation, I think for these types of games is just completely top notch from an animation standpoint. The amount of story, character, charisma, and just mechanics that they made kind of just frame by frame is just really impressive, and I'll never stop being enamored by that, even though I completely stink at playing the games. So that's kind of how I am with a lot of games. I did play some MMOs for a while too, and I think that's an interesting way of thinking about stat balancing as well, because they're so competitive, and people have so many extensive discourse around like the roles of the characters and the balancing of the characters. So just spending a lot of time in those spaces and like theorizing about a lot of these things is probably ruminating somewhere in the back of my mind as I'm like making this game, which is very simple and not in any ways balanced to the extent of a lot of my inspirations. But with all that said, I would say the first thing to do when I was approaching my game was to think about what I needed and not incorporate anything more. So if you are heavily influenced by like a role-playing game or a type of game that you're trying to like base your mechanics around, just stop before you start implementing different stats and different mechanics, and shave it down to what are the absolute vital essentials, because things will start to grow and spiral from there anyways. But see if you can narrow it down to the least amount of stats, the least amount of variables, the least amount of mechanics as possible to begin with. So going into making my dice game, I knew I wanted to have like a fast, simple, snappy combat system that would have a lot of variance. So I was very heavily inspired by my experiences playing Dungeons and Dragons, that I thought each combat situation, whether it was like a random encounter of just like, you know, little fodder type characters, was just as kind of threatening as like a lot of the boss fights, because, you know, in my mind a lot of my approaches to like combat were more from a video game angle when I started playing tabletop games, that I was used to there being a set programmed win condition that I would be guaranteed if I did all the mechanics that that the game had been telling me to do, is that was how most video games program their combat, is that they will have some sort of mechanic that they want the player to execute, and then executing that required strategy will guarantee a win. Versus in tabletop gaming, that is not the case. There is a huge variance in results when you are dealing with a d20 dice, right? No matter what level your character is, no matter what level your enemy character is, all those stats kind of help stack the variables in your favor, but you're never guaranteed a certain outcome. So it puts pressure on the player even when they're running into like what should be a trivial encounter. Even some of the not even combat situations where you're just trying to like negotiate with somebody, and you could have like the most charismatic character created, and you could still like roll a nat 1, and now everything that you were planning on doing around that negotiation just fell through the floor. But the thing that kind of salvages this somewhat unfair reliance on random dice rolls is that the player can then be creative and come up with like a new plan. So you can never really lock into a specific plan and say, this is absolutely how I'm going to defeat this encounter. You have to be a little bit more, you have to be less rigid. You have to be more flexible in your thinking to be able to kind of like adapt to the new situation. This is one of the charming aspects of tabletop gaming that is never been able to be replicated in a video game, because that's the freedom we have in a story-based kind of like game where it's just the conversation back and forth between the dungeon master and the player, as opposed to something that needs to be pre-programmed. So I think that's one of the reasons why there's been kind of a resurgence in Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop type games, is because you do have that added freedom, that you don't have to follow kind of like this rigid structure that the programmer is trying to tell you to follow when it comes to tabletop. And I knew I wouldn't be able to replicate that experience completely, but I wanted to capture as much of it as I could with the limited amount of resources and knowledge that I have. So that is why I chose a dice system, and that is why the losing penalty in my game is so lenient, is because I knew that also the player was going to have a lot of situations where they just would not win through no fault of their own because of the randomness of like the numbers that were going to be coming out. So what did I need for my dice game? What was the bare minimum? I needed to have dice for the character. I needed to have a win condition. So in this case, it was going to be a shared health pool. So that was going to be another stat, as each unit was going to have health. And then I needed to have something that was going to differentiate characters from each other, because I wanted it to be sort of like the style of a hero collecting game in mobile spaces, where you are going to want to have more and more unique characters to create different combinations of these characters. So how am I going to make these characters unique from each other without one being flat out superior than the other one? So that's where I kind of came with the rock, paper, scissors type system, which a lot of mobile games employ, and is in a lot of role-playing games, but perhaps not as pronounced as in my game. So I wanted to have the rock, paper, scissors mechanic be strong enough that a character, even an elite character who was like of a certain elemental or faction disadvantage against a even common character, would not be preferable. I wanted the common unit, the element, and the faction to be the most deciding factor in this game. And so I tried to implement that by making those bonuses static. So in a game where you have like those random dice rolls, anywhere from like 1 to 4 or 1 to 10, which is a huge amount of variance. Having like a +1 or +2 or +3 is just flat bonus to your total rolls. You can stack the dice in your favor quite a bit, and again, this was influenced by D&D and kind of like how a lot of the bonuses work in D&D, to stack the dice in the player's favor. So a lot of like my pre-planning was just based on like D&D and a lot of those other types of games, and I didn't really have like a lot of like theory beyond that to back up my instincts with it. So like here you can see I have this like stat allocation that that all the common units were going to have a total pool of points of like 30 points, and that the dice allocation was going to take 2 points. So for every side of the dice, that's going to be 2 points. That's going to be from that 30-point pool. And then the hit points was going to be 1, because I wanted the dice to weigh more heavily than the health, because I knew that the number of sides of the dice was going to have a heavier impact than the amount of health that's contributed to the health pool. Simply because, like, if you have, like, 3 characters that have 10-sided dice versus 3 characters that have 4-sided dice, the chances of the players with the 4-sided dice ever rolling higher than the party with the 10-sided dice is going to be so low that it doesn't matter if they have like 1,000 more hit points than the players with the 10-sided dice, because their win ratio, or their ability to their chances of rolling a higher total score than the 10-sided dice is going to be so low that their health is going to be trivial in comparison. So I thought, well, a 2 to 1 ratio should be pretty good for that, because I don't want that health to become too high in any scenario that it like drags out that, And then for formation position, so there are 2 classes in my game that can switch formation position, which gives them a little bit more flexibility. So I decided that, well, that's going to cost some points. And then the skills, having a skill, like the elite characters that have skills, that's going to cost points. So you can see with like a character with a common, well, I guess I think I erased it because I'm just trying to keep my okay, so here you can see with your standard common knight unit, you have a dice allocation of 4, so that's going to be 8 points, and then they have 19 health, and then they have 1 position, which is going to be 3, so that's 20 points right there. I'm sorry, that's 30 points right there, because we've got 12 points with the formation, the 1 position that they can go into. So every character is going to take 3 points regardless. And then the rogue and the priest characters that can switch positions are going to take 6 points with that. So, I mean, it's not that big of a penalty. But that's kind of how that looks. And so if this knight was an elite knight, with all the same stats, and then you give them a skill, that's going to take 5 points of their 10-point plus allocation, and then they would have another 5 points to like have potentially like 5 more health. So the difference between the elite characters and the common characters stat-wise is not that big. Having an extra 5 health isn't really that big of a deal in this game. It's the skills that kind of make or break more of the difference. But even those, I wouldn't say it makes or breaks anything, because I've definitely had plenty of encounters where I have 3 elite units against 3 non-elite units and still manage to lose, especially if I'm at a bonus disadvantage. that happens quite often if I'm at a bonus disadvantage. Now, if I have high bond with those characters, that offsets a lot of the bonus disadvantage, and then I'm almost always guaranteed to win if, like, after you take it in account bond bonuses, if my bond bonuses are greater than the faction and elemental bonuses, then that that usually turns the tide back in the player's favor. So when I'm creating skills, when I was first creating skills, I was thinking more along the lines of being heavily influenced by a lot of mobile games, but a lot of mobile games have very static stats. The variance between how much the character, like the amount of damage they can deliver, is usually negligible if there's any at all. The outcomes are almost always foretold to the point where you can just skip battle in a lot of these games because there's really no RNG or barely any RNG in those games for the most part. And so a lot of like the types of skills that they would have would be at a much lower percentages than what I ended up having my skills be at, because one of the things that it does not take into account with a lot of games with like set stats like strength, agility, dexterity, intelligence, where all those things are kind of like set and the growth is like based on like level. So like if I have a level 1 mage, he's always going to do 10 damage, and then when he's level 2 he always does 20 damage, and then when he's level 3 he always does 30 damage. When you have those types of stats, any multiplier or any like skill that's going to be like, okay, fireball is going to be like their intelligence times 2, you know, so now it's always going to do, a level 1 mage is always going to do 20 damage, always going to do, you know, a level 2 mage is always going to do 40 damage. Then that times, you know, 2 is like huge, because it's already taking like a set number and it's multiplying that. When you have something like a dice-based game where that character can do anywhere from like 1 to 10, suddenly when you do that fireball and it's like times 2, well, now you only did 2 damage when you roll a 1. You only did 4 damage when you rolled a 2. So having like fireball like trigger at like a 10% chance or something, which would be like at a fixed stat, would be really good, because you're always going to do superb damage. You're always going to do twice as much. Now suddenly you have a scenario where sometimes you're not going to do as much as a normal roll would. Like 50% of the time it's going to be pretty So you have to keep that in mind, where now if I have like only a 10% chance of doing like a fireball, well, there's 50% of the time that fireball is going to be kind of crappy. So really I only have like maybe like a 5% chance of like doing anything that's going to be like worth doing, or like that's going to be a special. So, and maybe only 1% of the chance, you know, that's actually going to turn the tide of battle. So that is why all my percentage skill triggers are so high, is because when you have a dice-based system, like half the time the dice is going to be kind of bad. So the other thing that I incorporated in a lot of my elite unit skills is like having a base bonus based on their bond level. So now you know, at least their skill is going to be like better than nothing, because you have like a potential to have like a static like +4. As opposed to like having just whatever multiplier. So any of the multipliers I had to kind of like be very careful with, because they could either be like huge, like, oh my gosh, I just rolled like a 10, or they could be totally, you know, pitiful, like, oh my god, I just rolled a 1, and so like this skill is like worthless. So I tried adding that static bond bonus to at least make it worthwhile to the player. And I had to, especially with the 2 newest characters, balance their abilities in ways that I hadn't predicted until I started testing them. So let me show you a little bit of like what that looks like. So on paper, we have Basil, who is a duelist, and so in my mind, I wanted her to be able to have a chance of copying another character's dice to create a double bonus situation. Originally, it was going to only trigger when you lose a skirmish round. She was going to get kind of like a state of like counter, where the next time you roll your dice, she's going to have a chance to do a double bonus. So having this condition be based on losing a skirmish and then having a percentage chance to trigger on the next thing was just terrible. It just didn't trigger enough to make it like worthwhile to in comparison to a lot of other character skills. So then I decided to have it just be okay, well, she's just going to have a chance to do it. Every skirmish, she's just going to have a chance to put this double bonus on herself, which I lowered this percentage down to 30%, which I thought made it trigger often enough that it was that it would trigger on most battles at some point, without having it be overpowered. But then an interesting thing also occurred, again, due to the nature of the dice system, is that quite often she would double bonus on things like a 1 or a 2. And especially depending on what her party members were like. And so it wasn't as good as I wanted it to be. It was just kind of like, okay. It works when you have a... if you use Lucky Strike, if you save up for a Lucky Strike, which takes 5 rounds, which is a long time in this game. If it happens to trigger with that, most of the time that's a pretty good result, but like oftentimes that could even be sort of subpar. Because it didn't have any type of a static bonus to it. It really made this ability somewhat meh in a lot of situations. So how I went about trying to kind of buff this ability to be good. So she's supposed to copy this dice. And I don't know what the heck. Why does this keep doing this? This is supposed to be a if P roll 1, or no, if P roll 2 is greater than P roll 3, then we're going to have her copy 3. Or no, we're going to have her copy 2. So I basically made her have a 33% chance of like always picking the higher roll out of the 2 companions. So maybe they'll both still roll 1s and it'll still be kind of a meh. But at least she has a higher chance of like doing something like decent without it, like, because I did also do a version of this where she always picked the higher roll, and that was like too much. That was like she was like always getting like really good double strikes or double steps, and it was too much. So having her just have this level of this chance of having like a higher double seemed to balance her out and make her skill strong enough that I thought it was good, without it being like overpowered, in my opinion. Okay, why do I keep not saving this? I've made this change so many times, I swear. Okay. So then the other problem that I had with Bailiff. So I wanted his skill to have something to do to boost the faction and elemental bonus. So I thought, well, you know, maybe he'll have a percentage chance of boosting the faction and elemental bonus. The problem with this skill, again, because it's on a multiplier, is that the faction bonus and the elemental bonus can be anywhere from like 1, which times 2 is pretty lackluster, 0, which also can be pretty lackluster. It can be negative, where this skill is designed to not trigger at all if you have a negative bonus. So those are all situations where his skill is completely or almost worthless. Or you can be in a situation at level 4 or 5 or even level 3 where if you have a really good bonus, you could have like a 20-point bonus, wherein his ability is suddenly ridiculous, like one-shotting people, guaranteed to one-shot. So that's like too much. And I thought, well, at first of all, I knew this was going to be a problem. I was like, well, maybe he will be the type of character that'll just be really good to have in a situation where you have really good faction elemental bonus at higher levels, and that will help offset some of the just insane difficulty that those higher levels can have at times. But it just really was not working the way I wanted it to. I really had to introduce something that was going to be more of a static bonus. But I still wanted to keep in mind, or keep this faction and elemental bonus a part of like the bonus, to make that to fall in line with the core idea of the character. So what I ended up doing instead of ×2, which this is going to sound like completely counterintuitive, but I guess that's just how broken my original concept was, is so I made a variable that was going to be this extra bonus that Tactical Edge was going to apply to the elemental and faction bonuses. And this bonus would be the elemental and faction bonus total, so those two bonuses combined, divided by 2 plus his bond. So we have enough, like, we have a little bit of influence from the elemental and the faction bonus of the player. We've toned it down to something that's going to be more manageable, but will still be high if those numbers are very high. And then we've added his bond bonus to make sure that it's never negligible, that it's never nothing. Like +4 static bonus in this game is always welcome. That's always like decent. If you happen to max them out, like we will take that. It's not, going to make or break. It's not going to offset, like if the player has like no bonus and the enemy has like a 20-point bonus or something at level 5. It's not going to offset that. But this, in combination with other things, is going to be very welcome. So that is how I went around balancing those skills. Again, this is all coming from the base of like having the bare minimum stats. The more types of stats you add, of course, the more things you are going to have to balance. And you'll have to keep in mind, is this a variable stat? Is this a stat that is going to have high ranges of effectiveness, high and low ranges of effectiveness? Or is this going to be a very static stat where the outcome is going to be the same? And those are going to have to be like considered when you're making your stats. The other thing that you're going to have to consider, besides like, do I want my game to be something that's going to have a lot of variance to it, a lot of unpredictableness, a lot of RNG, or is this going to be a game that has like very predictable outcomes? I don't really see the purpose of having ranges that are so small that they're negligible. The player's not stupid. They're not going to look at that and be like, well, I can do anywhere from like, 100 to 110 damage. Who cares? Why do I care that there's like a 10-point variation at that number? Now, when you have like, I can do anywhere from like 1 to 5, that's a huge range, and then you're going to be thinking about things more from the perspective of the dice rolling. But when you have numbers like somewhere from like 100 to like 110, that 1% difference, if you have something like a 1% variance, I would personally argue that that's not even worth programming. Who cares? Who cares about that 1% variance? Like under the super unsubstantial situation that maybe that 10% or that 1% variance would like make or break a fight. Like that situation is going to happen so infrequently that when it does happen, it's just going to frustrate the player because they're like going to be used to that predictable outcome. So do you want to have predictable outcomes that reward the player basically following your win condition, or do you want to have a more RNG based system that is going to make the outcome less predictable for the player? There are pros and cons to either approach, but I guess that would be maybe the first thing that you consider, and then you can start considering like the very minimal amount of stats that you would need to execute that win condition. What is the type of strategy that you want your player to have to evoke, to perform? If you have a very set and consistent win condition that is not dependent on RNG, that can be very boring if the challenge is not high. So a lot of games that have very like set outcomes will have like a very high level of like extra types of things that influence that set outcome, whether that be like, okay, we're going to add a pet mechanic, a summoning mechanic, gear, different skill trees within those skill trees. That is one of the reasons like why like so many modern mobile hero collecting games have like so many different paths of growth that you have to grind. Like, okay, we have gear, we've got 6 pieces of gear for every character, we've got different skill tree, abilities that we need to like put on them. We've got different like I don't know, different other types of like buffs or like trinkets or like, things that we need to like equip and like level up and build outside of the character. We need to build up their faction. We need to build up their, they've got so many different like paths that you have to like level up besides just the character level, the character stats, the character's gear, in order to try to make these very predictable outcomes interesting. We need to like create all these different paths of investment so that the player has something to do other than watch like predictable fights just like play out. And at some point like these levels will cap. So in a lot of like JRPGs, boss fights are basically just like level checks to make sure that, okay, did you level up your characters high enough to like defeat this encounter? Okay, good, you're at a high enough level, you win. Some of these battles might like have certain skills that you want to use in order to like defeat the boss. They might have some kind of like little, I don't know, element or attribute that you're like, okay, I've got a mage, I need to use like fire skills on like the air boss or something. But as long as I keep on using these fire skills whenever I have the resource to do so, then I'm going to defeat it. Like, no brainer. A lot of people do find these types of turn-based games to be kind of boring or tedious because these outcomes are so predictable. So what do we do to try to make them more interesting? We have very beautiful graphics. We have like interesting character interactions and dialogues. And then like combat is sometimes just something that we just endure in order to like see the cool stuff and learn more about the characters and watch the story progress. And this is all viable. This is all some of the experience that some people want. But the other thing is incorporated in a lot of games that have very predictable set kind of like win conditions that you just need to follow the formula and then you win, is difficult execution. So that happens a lot with fighting games, with platformers. We have a certain input that we want the player to use in XYZ situation, and when they do that, they are guaranteed like the outcome of like having the higher priority, hitting the opponent, of like clearing the obstacle. And of course, like the higher the level, the difficulty of timing this execution, the more predictable the outcome has to be. You can't make a system where it's difficult to put in the input and then introduce RNG as just like, well, you have a 50% chance of, or you have like a variance of how much this character is going to jump, every time you press this jump button, and then you also have to time this jump precisely, but you only have a 50% chance of clearing it. Like, people would just be so frustrated, and I think that's one of the reasons why games like Flappy Bird are so frustrating, is because the input control is so difficult that it really feels like when you tap the flapping, it just goes all over the place, which can be sort of like fun and in a meme of itself, but in general, you can either make a game interesting by having difficult execution and very predictable outcome to that execution, or you can have a game that is fun because the it's unpredictable in the outcome, and you can make those types of games have easy execution as far as like player input, but they can still find it interesting because they don't know what to expect to see next. So that's another, I guess, thing to consider when you're trying to balance like how much RNG do I want to have in this game, or how much of the how much do I want to have like a set mechanic that is going to give the player a very predictable outcome consistently. And so some games also like Dungeon Delve, kind of like games where you have like your RNG based in the like equipment that will make the character stronger. So in some ways, like their time investment, instead of having set like XP, like, okay, I kill this many enemies in this amount of time and I will be rewarded with this amount of character growth, you're making the character growth be RNG based. So that can be kind of make the grind or the monotony of like slaughtering the same enemy with the same outcome over and over and over and over and over and over again. It can make that very monotonous, predictable outcome more engaging, because now the reward is based on RNG. And some games like the what do you call it, the now I can't remember the name of the game series, but they had your every time you level up, your stat bonuses that you gained, that was RNG based. So like sometimes if you used like a lot of like one type of weapon, then you would have a chance of like increasing your strength or increasing your agility or your dexterity, but those were all also kind of random. And then you have some games where you could actually like lose stat values on level up, and that's not usually a very popular mechanic, but I can sort of see what they were going for. But I don't think at any point in any of these games, I don't think it's a good idea to waste players' time and punish them for spending time in your game. I think that's probably one of the worst decisions that you could possibly make, especially when time is such a valuable commodity in today's very high-paced environment where we have a lot of different options on how we can spend our time. Please don't waste the player's time. Please don't make mechanics just for the sake of being frustrating and annoying to the player. Please don't do that. I know that there are some games that that become popular despite being very difficult, but I don't think that making games very difficult and punishing and wasting people's time a lot is something that's like should be a feature that you should be like counting on making everything else in your game so spectacular that the player will be willing to put up with that. Okay, I think I've made this video long enough. Please let me know if you have any more questions or comments or anything that you want me to expand upon in the comments section. There's probably a lot more that I could talk about. I already kind of cut out like 20 minutes of this video where I just kind of just gushed on and on about fighting games and about the interesting discourse around balanced and unbalanced characters and mechanics and series in those games and the pros and cons of all of that. So I really could like talk about the subject like forever, because I think it's very interesting. But my final advice for you or for anybody would be just play a lot of different games, take from a lot of different sources in your inspiration. If you're writing a fantasy novel, or writing a fantasy game, creating a fantasy game, don't just read fantasy novels and just watch fantasy movies and read and play fantasy games. Like, I get most of my inspiration for like my writing, even though I love like fantasy, from like documentaries. I am very interested in history and biology and animals and ecology and psychology. I'm interested in all the different things that make the world work in the way that it does, and so that's where I get a lot of like my more fantastical ideas of like, well, how would it work in like a game that in a new world that I like created, you know. And I think that can go for like game mechanics as well. Like if you can take inspiration from, you know, some other game genre than the game genre that you are creating, that would be maybe a more interesting game than like the games in that genre. I probably personally would be more interested in it. That's just me personally. I don't think that there should be a set formula that one should pursue in order to balance a game. I think the main objective should be, is this fun for the player? Is this enhancing my story and my characters? Is this fun? And yeah, and that should be your goals. And you can pretty much start anywhere. And if it's not fun for you and it's not fun for your immediate like little group of people who might be willing to test out your game, then you probably should start with something else or change some things around until it does feel fun. I think that's all I've got for now. And yeah, enjoy the process. And thanks for watching. Bye.